and adulation he deserves.
It's like unconquered territory.
Imagine standing in a field with 120,000 strangers, watching a man you idolize walk out under a 5-ton crown of lights, not knowing that in a few hours he will step off that stage and never sing live again. His doctors had told him not to go on. His voice was cracking under the strain of a punishing tour. And yet on the evening of August 9th, 1986, Freddie Mercury walked toward the microphone anyway. What the crowd at Knebworth Park saw that night looked like triumph. What was happening around him, in the wings, in his own body, and in the years that followed, was something far stranger and far sadder than most fans ever realized. This is the story of the last time Freddie Mercury ever performed live and the strange, quiet details that made it unforgettable. Freddie Mercury was born Farrokh Bulsara on September 5th, 1946, on the island of Zanzibar, then a British protectorate off the coast of East Africa. His parents were Parsi, followers of Zoroastrianism, one of humanity's oldest religions, and their household blended Persian tradition with the rhythms of colonial East Africa. As a boy, Freddie was sent to a boarding school near Bombay in India, far from his family, where teachers noticed something unusual in him almost immediately. He had a striking singing voice and an ear for melody that set him apart from other children his age, and it was at this school that he first started going by the nickname Freddie, a name that would follow him for the rest of his life. He formed a small band with a few classmates, playing covers of rock and roll songs by artists like Little Richard, and even then, teachers and friends could tell that music was going to be central to whatever life he built for himself. Everything changed when revolution swept through Zanzibar in 1964. The political violence forced his family to flee, and they eventually settled in England, where teenage Freddie had to rebuild a sense of home from nothing. He enrolled in art school, eventually studying graphic design at Ealing Art College, a decision that would quietly shape the rest of his career, because years later, he would draw Queen's now-famous crest logo himself, blending the zodiac symbols of the band members into a single royal emblem. While studying, he crossed paths with musicians who would change his life, guitarist Brian May and drummer Roger Taylor, who were playing together in a band called Smile. Freddie became a fixture around them, offering opinions on their sound and their stage presence long before he was officially part of the group. When the band singer left in 1970, Freddie stepped into the role, and it was Freddie who suggested a new name for the group, Queen, because he wanted something that sounded regal and unforgettable. Bassist John Deacon joined a year later, completing the lineup that would go on to define a generation of rock music. Success did not come quickly. Queen's first 2 albums barely made a dent on the charts, and there were moments when it looked like the band might fade into obscurity before it had really begun. Their fortunes turned with their 3rd record, which included the song Killer Queen, a witty, theatrical track about a high-society woman that showcased everything unusual about Freddie's songwriting. He had written the lyrics before the music that time, which was backwards from his usual process, and the finished song became the band's first real hit. Just a year later came Bohemian Rhapsody, a song built from 3 distinct sections stitched together into something radio executives were sure would never work on air. It took weeks to record, involved well over 100 vocal overdubs, and became, at the time, one of the most expensive singles ever produced. Record label executives wanted it cut down for radio, but the band refused, and it was only after their manager quietly gave an early copy to a sympathetic disc jockey that the song found its way to the public and shot to the top of the charts, where it would return again after Freddie's death, staying there for weeks. Queen's stage shows grew alongside their fame. Early tours used modest lighting rigs. By the mid-1980s, their concerts featured elaborate lighting structures weighing tons, custom-built stages with long walkways stretching into the crowd, and sound systems so powerful that people living miles from the venue could hear the music drifting through their windows. Freddie's own stage persona transformed just as dramatically. He began his career as a shy performer who hid behind his piano, uncomfortable holding the audience's full attention. Over time, he became one of the most commanding frontmen in rock history, partly by accident. The base of his microphone stand snapped off during a show early in his career, and rather than replace it, he kept performing with the broken stand, discovering that it gave him room to move, spin, and command the stage in a way the full stand never had. His look shifted too, from glam-inspired jumpsuits sewn onto him before each performance, to a leaner, mustached, leather-clad image in the 80s inspired partly by the club culture he found in New York. By 1985, Queen's fortunes had been reignited by an extraordinary 20-minute set at Live Aid, a performance now remembered as one of the greatest in rock history, even though Freddie took the stage that day with his voice already under strain. That momentum carried directly into 1986 and the album A Kind of Magic, written partly as a soundtrack companion to the film Highlander. The album's success set up what would become the band's most ambitious tour yet, a run of 26 shows across 9 countries in only a few weeks, built around a colossal stage and a lighting rig crowned by a massive gold structure. It was called the Magic Tour, and it would end at Knebworth Park in Hertfordshire, England, on the evening of August 9th. What almost nobody in the crowd that night knew was that Freddie had seen a doctor earlier that day. His throat was inflamed, his voice under real physical strain after weeks of nightly performances, and he was told plainly that pushing through another full show carried real risk. He performed anyway. As the opening chords of One Vision rang out across the field, Freddie walked out in a simple white tank top and jeans, looking every bit as confident as he had at any point in his career, even though those closest to him knew how much effort it was taking just to stand there. During Under Pressure, his voice cracked on a difficult note, and rather than push through alone, he turned the moment over to the crowd, letting 120,000 voices carry the line with him, turning a moment of vocal strain into one of the most touching parts of the whole show. When the band reached Who Wants to Live Forever, a song already steeped in themes of mortality and time running out, the lyrics landed with a weight that felt almost unbearable in hindsight, though at the time most fans simply heard a beautiful ballad performed with real feeling. Bohemian Rhapsody came later in the set, and even though the operatic middle section had usually been played from a backing tape during live shows, because it was so difficult to recreate, Freddie chose to sing portions of it live that night, reaching for notes he had not attempted on stage in years. When the band closed with We Are the Champions, his voice cracked again, and again he refused to pull back, holding the note out rather than softening it. As the final song, God Save the Queen, played the band out, Freddie did something he did not always do. He stayed on stage rather than leaving early, standing still with his eyes closed as the music faded around him. He bowed to the crowd, thanked them, wished them a good night, and walked off. Nobody in that field, and by most accounts, none of the 4 members of the band, fully understood in that moment that they had just watched Freddie Mercury's final live performance. The mood backstage afterward was heavier than the triumphant show on stage would have suggested. The band had spent much of the mid-1980s under real strain, both from the physical demands of touring and from tension between the members that had built up over years of close collaboration. Brian May later admitted that there were stretches during this period where the relationships within the band had grown genuinely difficult, and some band members have spoken since about how emotionally taxing that final Knebworth show felt to perform, sensing, without quite being able to name it, that something about this run of shows marked an ending. Roger Taylor has described finding Freddie sitting quietly by himself after the concert, looking exhausted in a way that went beyond ordinary post-show tiredness, and has spoken about how differently that memory reads now compared to how it felt on the night itself. At the time, it seemed like simple fatigue after a grueling world tour. Looking back, many around Freddie have described it as something closer to a farewell that none of them recognized as one. Freddie himself left the venue faster than usual that night, which struck people close to him as out of character, since he typically enjoyed lingering after a show to unwind with the crew. On the drive back toward London, those with him remember him staying unusually quiet, watching the passing scenery rather than joining the usual post-concert conversation. It would be almost a full year before Freddie was formally diagnosed with HIV in the spring of 1987. Those who were close to him have said in later interviews that certain symptoms had appeared even earlier, including a worrying visit to a doctor about a spot on his tongue during a trip to New York years before. For a long time after his diagnosis, Freddie kept the details of his health almost entirely private, even from many people within his own inner circle, at a moment in history when public attitudes toward AIDS were shaped heavily by fear and stigma, and tabloid newspapers were aggressively speculating about his declining appearance in print. Despite his failing health, Freddie kept working. In 1990, Queen recorded the album Innuendo, adjusting their studio schedule around his condition, working in shorter stretches so he could rest between sessions. One of the songs from that record, The Show Must Go On, became something close to a personal anthem, and Brian May has said he doubted whether Freddie would even be physically capable of singing the demanding vocal part. According to accounts from those in the studio, Freddie insisted on trying anyway and delivered the vocal in a single take. His last recording session took place in May of 1991, when he laid down vocals for a track called A Winter's Tale, which would later appear on the posthumous album Made in Heaven, released years after his death using material the band had been quietly assembling from his final sessions. Freddie Mercury's very last public appearance came well before that, in February of 1990, when Queen accepted an award for outstanding contribution to British music. He looked visibly thin, and the audience noticed, though few understood the full reason why. He said only a brief thank you before leaving the stage, a quiet ending to a public career built on some of the loudest, most theatrical performances in rock history. His health declined steadily through the following year, and by that November, he had stopped taking most of his medication aside from what was needed to manage pain. On November 23, 1991, a statement was released confirming publicly, for the first time, that he had AIDS. He died the following day, November 24, 1991, at his home in Kensington, London, at the age of 45 from pneumonia brought on by the illness. In the years since, the strangeness of that final Knebworth concert has only deepened in the retelling. It was a show built entirely around spectacle, a colossal stage, a 5-ton lighting crown, walkways stretching into a sea of fans, and yet its most lasting significance had nothing to do with any of that engineering. It came down to a handful of small, human moments. A cracked note turned into a sing-along, a decision to sing live what was usually played from tape, a man choosing to stay on stage a few seconds longer than he needed to. None of the 120,000 people in that field that night knew they were witnessing an ending. Freddie Mercury never announced a farewell tour, never gave a final bow explicitly framed as his last, and the strangest part of his story may be exactly that. One of the most theatrical performers in the history of popular music left the stage for the final time, without any fanfare at all, in a performance that looked, to almost everyone watching, like just another spectacular night with Queen. Today, that Knebworth performance is remembered as one of the defining moments in Queen's history, not because anyone realized at the time what it meant, but because of everything that came after it. Freddie Mercury's voice continues to reach new listeners decades later. His songs remain fixtures on radio stations and streaming platforms around the world, and Queen's greatest hits collection remains one of the best-selling albums in British chart history. In April of 1992, the surviving members of the band organized a tribute concert at Wembley Stadium in his honor, watched by an estimated 1 billion people worldwide, raising money for AIDS research and helping launch a charitable foundation that continues that work today. What began as a quiet, uncelebrated final show in an English field has become, with the benefit of hindsight, one of the most poignant nights in the history of live music. A performer giving everything he had left to an audience that had no idea it was the last time they would ever see him do it.